Good evening, everyone. I'm Annette Insdorf, the lucky person who gets to talk to the enormously talented Tony Kushner and Michelle Williams. And as I'm sure everyone here is aware, congratulations are in order because we are talking not only to gifted people, but Academy Award nominees, Best Actress in a Leading Role, Best Original Screenplay. I'm going to start out with a few questions for each of them. We will be taking questions from the audience on index cards. So be aware that ushers will be passing by at various moments and you can write your questions down. I'm going to start with Tony Kushner because this is your fourth collaboration with Steven Spielberg. And in fact, it's the first that you've written together after your solo scripts for Munich, Lincoln, West Side Story. And it's also Spielberg's first screenplay credit since AI, artificial intelligence, back in 2001. So in asking you about the process of creating the screenplay, I wanted to start with a question that I was curious about. How well did you know Spielberg's parents? Because Leia Spielberg died in 2017 and Arnold Spielberg in 2020. Did you know them? Were you able to use that towards the script?
I never met Leia, and I don't know why that is, because I've worked with Steven for 19 years. We never met. Maybe she was mad at me about Munich. I don't know if that's true. But I met Arnold on the set of Munich. He came to Budapest, I believe, or I think it was Budapest. For the part of the film that we filmed there. I met him again, I believe, on the set of Lincoln, and then a couple of other times at Steven's house. And I always liked him enormously. He was just a very gentle, approachable guy. I had no idea who he really was. I mean, I knew he was Steven's father, but it wasn't until I started working on the Fabelmans. You know, I knew that he had a reputation in computer engineering, and that he'd worked for RCA and then General Electric and then IBM. Steven told me when we started doing the interviewing that when he first met Bill Gates said, "I hope you're not offended. I'm happy to meet you, but I really would like to meet your father." Because Arnold was part of a team at RCA that began to envision computers as platforms for multiple users. And when he went to GE, he developed a machine that sort of behind the backs of the upper echelon people at GE that got him the job at IBM. And it's really one of the, some of the things that he worked on with memory storage became incredibly important for the development of the personal computer and for everything that followed. So he was really a significant figure. And I learned a lot about him from people who worked at the Shoah Foundation because he was brought in to the Shoah Foundation to work at the age of 80-something because they had done hundreds of thousands of interviews of Holocaust survivors and survivors of the Rwandan genocide, and they needed to figure out some way to store all this data and make it accessible, and it was still fairly, you know, a couple of decades ago, and I think a guy who worked at the Shoah Foundation who had been at Dartmouth said Steven's father would know something about this, so they brought him in, and he helped them put together this data retrieval system for the Shoah Foundation.
Amazing. Wow. One more question for you before we go to Michelle Williams. The process of actually writing a screenplay together. I gather that this began during the pandemic. In other words, that you were writing kind of over Zoom, and that even before that, you had been talking with Spielberg during Munich about doing a personal story like this. So did you write one scene and then he would revise it? Was it more that you were talking through the project? In other words, because writing a screenplay, if it's just you sit in a room, you write the damn thing. But when it's collaboration, especially during COVID, just what was the process like? Or did he write a scene and then you revised it?
I interviewed him in the spring after he had finished all the post-production work on West Side Story, and we were getting ready for the West Side Story release. I started doing formal really taking a lot of notes. And then in the beginning of the summer, I guess this was 2020, I said, I think we were going to call the family the Fabelmans. And I said, now you have to name all the family members. So he named them one by one. And then I said, I want to take all these interviews and go off by myself and try and write a kind of a novella. I didn't know it was going to be 81 pages. That's what it turned into. But using every single memory he told me, and to try and figure out a possible storyline. I came back with an enormous, I mean, it could have been a 6-year television series. So we then went, and I mean, that tends to be true of everything I do. We went in September. I sent it to him. I did it in 3 stages: New Jersey, Arizona, and California, and I sent each one to him. And he was getting more and more excited. And then in September, just on the phone, we started going through the outline, through the we called it the Gans Megillah, the
Gans
novella,
Megillah?
the Gans Megillah, the novella that I'd written, and then boiled it down to an outline pretty quickly in about 3 weeks. And then on October 2nd, we had a phone date, and I got on the phone with him. It was a Zoom call, and he said, let's start. And I said, I never start writing without at least 2 or 3 years of trying to avoid writing, and then I feel like and he said, let's do it. Let's write a scene. So there's a tool on Final Draft software called Collaboration, where you can see each other type. Steven does. I type much better than Steven does. So we were on Zoom, so we could see each other, and I was always had a terror of doing this, of saying lines out loud. I don't think I actually ever said any of the characters' lines out loud. He would, and then I would write down what he said, and then I would I would type things, and he would read them as I was typing them. But it was line by line together. There was very little that we wrote. There were a couple of scenes that I said, I'll do them before our next session. We did it 3 days a week, 4 hours a day, for 2 months, and we finished the whole screenplay. As opposed to, for instance, I don't know what you're applauding about for, like work ethic or something. I mean, Steven has an astonishing work ethic. It took me 5 years to write Lincoln. I mean, I'm slow, and we were both actually kind of in shock. But it was the most fun I've ever had writing anything. I loved it. And I had worked with Steven on all the other screenplays. I mean, I would hand stuff in, and then we'd go over it line by line. So I knew that he was a great writer. Also, he wrote Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I mean, one of the great screenplays, one of the great films ever. So, and some of the most beautiful lines in the movie are things that just popped out of his mouth. And a lot of the time, my job was to make sure that he didn't cut or try and change them, because he went after some of them, and I wouldn't let him do anything to them. But it was completely collaborative.
That's great. So we're talking about process here, and I'm interested for you, because I have admired you in so many different kinds of roles in different films. I think of After the Wedding, for example, Manchester by the Sea. I mean, there are many. And here you're playing a different kind of character, loosely based, obviously, on Spielberg's mother. But could you tell us a little about how you prepared for this? For example, it looked to me like you were really playing a Steinway piano. Did you take piano lessons? Did you sit down at any point with Spielberg to go through family albums? Was it important for you to have some kind of realistic source, or was it the script and direction that simply pulled you through?
Gosh, well, like Tony, I could prep forever. I would be happy to spend 5 years in prep. I think it's like a place where I go to worry. It's a place where because once, the first time that you hear action, that all of that energy can't exist anymore. So all of that worry. So I like to prep for a really long time to sort of get my worries out. And it's so different with everything that you do. When you have a lot of time, sometimes prep is thinking about how to rearrange scenes and dialogue, and like, this thing doesn't quite work here, so what can I imagine? And then when you have like a masterwork, you're not spending any time thinking about, is this what I would say here? You're just trying to, the thing that I felt so strongly when I read this script, when I closed the script, is I was like, so it's up here, and I just have to jump. Like, this thing exists, it lives, it breathes, it's already living and breathing, and I just have to figure out how to get as high as it is. So, so for this, it's a lot of looking through family albums and so many recordings and so many personal memories, and talking to Steven and talking to his sisters and talking to, anyone that knew her had like a story to share about her. So it's being available to those conversations. And I kind of think of it as like architecture that you're sort of building when you're playing somebody who walked. You're building the architecture of them. You have to like get the kind of like the bones and the hard matter, and then once you've assembled that, then it's breath and blood. So the first sort of part of prep is this scaffolding, and then you're trying to figure out how to like breathe through it. So I always say there's one good day, and that's when you get the job, and then the rest of it is just shit. But there's one great day where you don't have any, like, they've chosen you, you have employment to look forward to, it's fabulous, and then the work begins.
And is the scaffolding necessarily more complex for someone who, as you put it, really did walk and live? I'm thinking of my week with Marilyn, where Marilyn Monroe. I'm thinking Fosse Verdon. I decided to give her top billing. I remember I saw it sitting in this audience when they did a preview, and you were on stage, I think, with Sam Rockwell, and I thought, that's Gwen Verdon. I'm not watching Michelle Williams. So you've had an uncanny ability to scaffolding, architecture. But even for a fictional character, do you have to get a sense of that?
I think it's different. When I played Marilyn, it really kind of like took my head off my body, because I just didn't know what I was doing. It was so excruciating, because I'd never had to learn how to unbreak myself and then remake myself, how to break myself and then remake myself in somebody else's form. And, I've lived however many years. At that point I was 30, so I've accumulated 30 years of habits and tendencies, and I had to rid myself of those, and it was so painful, and then remake myself in somebody's image. And there was a lot of really hard learning. I cried every day I left that set. And but at the end of it, I thought, okay, like I know a few things, and I would like to carry this forward. And it became easier the next time and easier the next time. I do think, like, the mini-series, I would love to make this as a mini-series, I'm just saying. I think it's the perfect artistic form, because you get to embed yourself with a character, but they change, their experiences grow, you get new scenes, you get new dialogue, so you're deepening your understanding of them, but you're taking them to new places. It's like doing a play, but the scenes change. So...
That's great.
But I think that the process is different for playing somebody who was, as opposed to somebody who's imagined.
Sure. Now, to go back to the draft, I understand that you finished a first draft in December 2020. I read that. How many drafts were there?
I think officially 11. 11. We did the next. We sort of stopped in shock in early December, and then started up again by the beginning of January. And between January and March, we were. I think by the time we sent you and Paul the script, it was in draft number 4, I think, is what I remember. It doesn't mean, the numbers don't mean anything, because you especially with Steven, every day he calls and says, well, why does he say that? And let's change this, and let's do that. And so it's, by the time you finish a new draft, it's actually 8 drafts within one draft, but it was around that, which is a pretty typical number. I think about 10 or 11 has been the number for each.
And I have a question because I happened to see a few nights ago Leopoldstadt, finally, which I thought was quite formidable. And I gather you at one point consulted with Tom Stoppard?
Yeah, I know Tom not very well, but I met him through Mike Nichols. He's been a close friend of Steven's since Empire of the Sun. And it was this great story. I don't know if I should.
Come on.
Steven had some issues with the boy, with the character that Christian Bale plays in the
Empire.
when Stoppard had finished the first version of the script, and they had a conversation apparently where Steven said, I think that the boy is too unlikable, and Stoppard didn't agree, and Steven said, well, I'm directing this movie, and Stoppard said, well, maybe you're not the right director for it. Which sometimes even Steven Spielberg, you have to say things. I've never said that to him, but he likes, that's one of the reasons that he's an amazing collaborator, because that doesn't ruffle him at all. So we showed it to I think Stoppard was the first or second person. I showed it to my husband, and I didn't show it to anybody else, because I knew that Steven really wanted to sort of control that. So we showed it to Stoppard and a couple of other people, and we waited to see what they thought. Mostly everybody was excited about it. Nobody said, I think one person said, do not do this movie. Your career will never, got really freaked out. And actually didn't say don't do it, but was just like, this is going to subject you to a level of scrutiny that you're not used to.
Now, once you had, let's say, the 11th draft and the actors were on board, was there some improvisation once shooting began, or did it stay pretty much close to the script, and were you on set during the shoot?
I've been on set for the entire shoot for all 4 movies. I don't know why, but he started on Munich. He kept me on set the whole time, and then in Lincoln, I had to sort of hide out because Daniel wasn't sure that he wanted me on set, because he didn't want the writer sitting there because he's in character the whole time. So I had to kind of hide behind people. Although he would occasionally throw me little handwritten notes to say hi, as in Abraham Lincoln's handwriting. It was a little weird. And I was on set the whole time for West Side Story. Screaming and yelling at Steven all day long, every day. That's one of the reasons I think the Fabelmans happened, is that he went back to this idea of doing a movie so that we could sit together and do interviews to remind each other that we really love each other, because West Side Story was hard. I mean, I think I'm very proud of the movie, but it was a tough thing. I fucking hate improv. I don't really hate it. Well, I do sort of hate it. I mean, I think that, well, I won't go into the whole thing.
I will. Some of these kids would walk up and they'd be like, I don't want to say that. I don't think my character would say that. I was like, do you know who you're talking to? Do you understand the breadth of what's come before? So you might think that's not what you want to say, but somebody knows better, and his name is Tony Kushner, and he's right here. I was like, just agog that they would, because I mean when you know, it's a Bible. It's a perfect document. It is like a perfect document, and it will it does your work. It's just like this, it's this unbelievable thing. You really don't have to work as hard. Like when you say these words and when you are like in these scenes, like I said, you just have to be as good as they are, but you don't have to work for it. You don't have to strategize and figure this thing out. So I was just...
when I was fetching to you on the set about a particular actor, you said this really smart thing that I then weaponized for the rest of the shoot. And you kind of referred to it a little while ago about doing a miniseries that you have, that what you don't have in film, for the most part, that you have in theater is rehearsal, and then repetition, the performance. And when we were talking at one point, you said, if you stick to the script, take after take after take, each take is a chance to deepen what you're doing and explore what you're doing. It's the closest you get to rehearsing and to that kind of exploration. If you add to that the necessity of rewriting the script each time you do it, it's you're gonna, I think it's a way, I think one of the reasons it's so appealing to a lot of young actors is that they're afraid of whether or not they're really going to have the tools to dig down deep as actors. So if they give themselves, the task of coming up with clever new ways to say the same thing, it protects them. We had a lot of fights about West Side Story and improv because it's a book for a musical, and the lines that you're going to say, you then have to go into Stephen Sondheim's lyrics, and you can't make up stuff. And then, and Stephen knows how I feel about it, and he said, right before we started the Fabelmans shoot, he said, Seth Rogen is in this movie, there's gonna be a lot of improvising, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. He was really relishing the idea of how miserable I would be. And Michelle and Paul came, didn't change a word. Seth came in, he never changed a single word, not a single word. It was thrilling. He said, well, why would I want to do that? I mean, it's it's hard work, improvising. I'll just do the script the way it is. So it was great.
Yeah. And Seth Rogen, I know that Spielberg said he chose Michelle Williams after seeing her magnificent performance in Blue Valentine back in 2010. But the film that I'm remembering around that same time is actually Take This Waltz that Sarah Polley directed, because Seth Rogen and you played husband and wife. And this was a marriage depicted as, strong enough, but there was the lure of desire and interdiction on the part of the female character for another man. So it was interesting to me that here you were with Seth Rogen again, but now he was the other man. And did you and he have a special kind of playful understanding based on the two parts?
We're going to meet up every decade and explore sexual themes together. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
I like the idea. Now, I attended a preview of West Side Story that included a discussion with the cast and crew afterwards. And I was so struck when Rita Moreno said, Tony Kushner created the part of Val for me, but then she went on to say that you created pages of backstory for every single major character. And I was curious if you did that also for the Fabelmans, and if so, what the benefit of that might have been for the actor.
The big 81-page novella was the closest thing I came. Mostly with West Side Story, since it's a musical, there just isn't as much real estate to develop backstory, and because we were doing something that really changed to a certain extent what people think about when they think about West Side Story, we wanted to make sure that the Jets and the Sharks and all the characters. So I just started doing it, and then I really got into it. And Rita's was 30 pages long. It was that was a blast to do that. We didn't need it really for the Fabelmans. We had a couple of conversations early on, but I didn't feel the need to sort of explore it to that extent. So,
okay. I mean, it seemed that there, obviously with the Fabelmans, you're dealing with fully realized characters that emerge from the memory of the director. So it's a very different kind of story. I just remembered something. I'm sorry, I have to ask you this. Doug Wright is a friend of mine. This is the brilliant playwright who wrote I Am My Own Woman and the play Quills and then the screenplay for the film. He told me that he had written a biopic of Peggy Lee called Fever that was to star you, and that Todd Haynes was going to direct it. And I remember getting so excited. May I ask where that project is at the moment?
You are alone in your excitement.
I remember Peggy Lee. I'm old enough, right? So that's not at the moment happening. Too bad.
I've worked with Todd Haynes a handful of times, and we've been friends for a long time, and we were really looking forward to collaborating with each other on something more sizable, and the three of us should get together.
Okay. As long as I'm into having heard people tell me something directly, I went to a party in October where I met Judd Hirsch. And I had already seen the Fabelmans, and I congratulated him. He was in a very warm mood. And he started to talk to me about this and said, Tony Kushner wrote every word of my dialogue as Uncle Boris. And my question then is, did you write all of that before the final script was done, before casting had happened? Or did you already know that Judd Hirsch would be playing Uncle Boris, and did that affect anything?
I don't know why Judd keeps saying that. It's not really.
I mean, there was
I kind of loved
there,
it
but,
because it made me feel good. But I mean, there were parts of the Boris monologues that I wrote in advance of one of our writing sessions because I wanted to construct a history for this guy. I mean, he's the only person from the Spielberg family who didn't get renamed. He wasn't Boris Podgorny. I forget what his last name was, but he was Boris. And he had worked out in Hollywood, lion trainers. He had a minion with Douglas Fairbanks and Ricardo Cortez and Edward G. Robinson. Steven promised me that we actually wrote a scene with those actors davening together and then we realized there was no place in the film.
Miniseries.
Right, exactly. Well, he promised me that we would shoot the scene and do all the CGI work and sort of glue Edward G. Robinson's head on some other actor's body, so that we would do it as like a kind of a little blooper thing at the end of the movie, and it didn't happen. I wrote a lot of that stuff just to, Selig Polyscope and the Uncle Tom's Cabin, and so Judd got very wedded to that. And I think Judd is also very much a guy of the theater, so we sort of bonded over that. I know that in my heart of hearts, I wanted Michelle to play Lee and Paul Dano to play Arnold. I didn't tell Steven that that's who I wanted for a long time while we were writing because I didn't know if he would say, oh, no, absolutely no way. I knew that he loved their work, but I didn't know, And then to my enormous relief at one point when we had enough of the script that we started fantasizing about who would play it. And I think he said, I think, what do you think about Michelle Williams? And I said, because I saw Michelle 100 million years ago in Williamstown, and in Michael Greif's absolutely
Cherry Orchard?
Astonishing production of Cherry Orchard, and went to the bar afterwards with my friend Linda Eamon, who played Ranovskaya, and my memory is that I must have terrified you because I was just, who are you? And because I'd never seen any, just like I was, it's what happens. You see suddenly you're there watching one of the great actors alive, and it's such a revelation. And
We should all be so terrified.
you looked a little creeped out, but at the time you were like, And then I asked her to do like 700 different things, and she was never.
Keep having babies.
You kept having, well, you had babies.
We're
and
the
you did
last one,
movies and, you know, all that stuff. And then we talked about Paul. Judd was Cindy Tolan, our brilliant casting director's idea. The minute she said it, it was like, well, of course. And I love his performance.
Oh,
so
no,
much.
when I saw the film, and I didn't know at that time that Judd Hirsch was even in it, and when he showed up, suddenly it was like, I sat up straighter in my chair because this was a galvanizing moment. And I remember leaning, I think I leaned over to my husband, Mark, and said, Oscar nomination, when he left the film, because it was so electric, though short, that I suspected there would be a movement, you know, towards his being nominated, you know, for the first time since Ordinary People, which is a great...
When we saw the movie in Toronto, which was the first time any of us had seen it with an audience at the Toronto Film Festival, and Judd was sitting right behind me, and he'd never seen the movie. And Steven gives him a little bow right before he gets in the taxi. He has a little moment, and I hated that and said, you have to cut that, Steven, that's terrible. But I was wrong, and it really works. And so he has this little bow, and at Toronto, it got this huge ovation. And I reached behind me, and I squeezed Judd's knee, and he leaned forward and said, there was a moment where I'm looking at Michelle, and I'm crying. Well, he cut that. Why did he cut that shot? I didn't care about the applause. It was like, he cut out my favorite moment.
Oh. By the way, I think someone's holding cards. Am I seeing cards over there? I shall take these and while I'm asking another question, because now that you've raised mention, I think you all know that Michelle Williams is not limited to screen work. This afternoon, in my class at Columbia University, I taught cabaret. And when I told my students that when they did the revival off-Broadway, the Sam Mendes version, that Michelle Williams' debut on the Broadway stage, essentially, was playing Sally Bowles in cabaret. I'm curious how, and you've been making so many superb films, how important is theater to you to keep doing that? Do you have plans to go back to the stage?
I realized at some point that it was a good way to work from home, and I figured, like, I better figure out how to do this, because travel is really hard on a family when you have young children, and so when I took cabaret, I thought, like, no matter what happens at the end of this, I'll be better, and so I'm going to go to school for a year, and they're going to pay me, and I was going to do something before the pandemic hit, and we still hope to make this very beautiful play that was off Broadway, to put it on Broadway. So it remains something that I'm invested in.
Okay. By the way, I just realized I should have brought my glasses on stage, because I can read fine when it's typed, and when it's handwritten by pencil, I am having some serious...
I could ask the questions instead of answer them.
Yes, actually, you could. I gather this one is for you. Be my guest. I'm sorry.
Oh. Oh, I think this is for you.
Michelle, how did you humanize a character that could be purely unlikable? We still rooted for you.
Well, you know, I think it's an interesting question, because it's interesting in terms of, like, what women are allowed to have, how and where, you know, this, like, question, this idea of, like, a good mother. Who is a good mother? Is a good mother a selfless mother? Is a good mother a mother who stays married? Is a good mother a mother who doesn't work? Like, what is a good mother? And I think, and what I felt so moved by when I read the script, was that a good mother is a woman who makes choices in accordance, who's in tune with herself, so that she can answer her own questions with assurance, and then acts on the answers that she receives when she, like, I don't know if this sounds corny, but like listens to her heart, who searches her soul, and when she finds the answer, she moves in that direction. So when I read the script, I thought, my God, you know, she doesn't have to suffer. She makes a choice, and there's no punishment. And I thought, first of all, for the time that she lived in, that she escaped that through this story, through this script, I was so moved by. But yeah, I suppose I didn't find her. I just found her to be passionate. And I also, the other thing that I think about it is that she made a choice. She liberated herself inside of her life, and I do believe that it liberated each one of her children. And if you met each one of her children, they are individuated, they are happy, they are free. She liberated herself, and she gave her children passive liberation. So I guess likable and dislikable didn't really enter my mind frame.
I think is really, you know, true of all of your work.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I wrote a new version of the last scene because I think I got cold feet and thought, oh, I didn't do this consciously, but I think I was thinking while we were on the set, I thought, you know, if she suffers a little bit more at the end, it'll for people who want her to be punished. And I showed it to Steven, and I think he was also nervous about this. And I gave Michelle the scene, and in her very elegant, gentle, loving way, she kind of moved it off to the side, and we stuck with the scene that was written. And I was actually kind of about that, because I really believed that I had done this, that this was a smart move and everything. And then the first time I watched the movie in the editing room, I thought, oh my God, she's so right. And it really would have been damaging to the film if we hadn't done it. But you got it, because great, great actors don't worry about being likable or unlikable. They worry about being human. And you know, that's what makes her performances always so astonishing, is that whoever she's playing, Gwen Verdon, or I remember seeing you at Juilliard. I ran into you, and you were preparing for Fosse Verdon, and it was this weird thing, because when you were coming up those long stairs in Juilliard, you were going on, I guess, to do some singing and dancing rehearsals, and you didn't look like Michelle. Maybe your hair, you had I don't know, I think you just had your regular hair, but it wasn't you. It was like somebody else on their way, and we said hi. But it's this unnerving thing, because that's what actors are able to do. Anyway, so this was your question, but
It was somebody's question out there. But I really felt that the character of Mitzi, as you play her, that she has this fragility, a kind of instability, you know, when she drives towards the tornado with the kids. And I actually, maybe because I showed a few weeks ago in my class A Woman Under the Influence, which is John Cassavetes' film with one of the most remarkable performances I've ever seen in a motion picture, Jenna Rollins playing Mabel. You know, how do you understand a female character who has been somewhat trapped by conventions and expectations of society? Did you feel an influence that was pressing down when you were trying to find the character? And by the way, because you mentioned Daniel Day-Lewis earlier, did you try to stay in character during the shoot? I mean, did you actively, like, don't talk to me as, you know, Michelle, talk to me as Mitzi, or no?
I mean, I think you retreat. It's sort of like being a boxer, and then like you go into your corner and you're kind of running, you know, the last round through your head, and then you're like thinking about the other moves that you might be able to pull out. And so I think that it's there's a kind of, I don't know, I just think like that time when you're at work, it's like so different than like the rest of life. You know, you turn your phone off, and it's you're in you make this space, and it's such a beautiful space. Like, why would you want to sort of interrupt it? Like, why would you want to let all the things that prevail in our like day-to-day lives, like this magical time opens up, and for 2 months or something, you're allowed to live in like a creative atmosphere. And I wish I could bring some of my work life into my like home. Like it's a beautiful place to just kind of stay and rest and stay like on your, like not rest, but like stay like on your toes, just like ready for the thing that comes next. So I don't really know what I call it, if it's like necessarily being in character. I honestly can't even remember. It's just kind of being in like the church with everyone. You're just kind of like trying to find like a common prayer that you're gonna like put forth into the, I don't know, I love to work. Yeah. I love that.
Do you ever have trouble leaving? Like when you go home to be with Tommy or with the kids, do you bring the character home with you ever?
No, never like at night. Like I feel like whatever that day was, it was always enough. Like it satisfied me. But I had a really hard time leaving this movie. Like I remember I was messed up. I love this woman, I love this family, I love these people. And I cried so hard when we wrapped our last scene that they thought, Tony came up to me and he said, "What happened?" And I was like, "We're done." And he's like, "Oh, okay, phew." Like he thought like somebody had gotten bad news or something. I was so affected by it. I just couldn't really shake it, honestly. And I still feel very emotional when I see you, when I see Steven. I just feel like drawn to that time when we shared this space, and I don't know.
He had a very hard time. I mean, he always has a hard time ending the films. With West Side Story, he kept us till like 1 a.m. watching Ansel Elgort looking at his reflection in a puddle, and Rita Moreno was going to do the last clapboard. We did like 85 takes. Steven never does that, but he just didn't want to stop filming because he couldn't bear to end the process. And with this, it was especially hard because it was letting go of his parents again in a certain sense. I think it was
It's a film about family, and it seems to have been made very much, as the French say, en famille. I mean, there was a family atmosphere, obviously, in which you all felt protected and inspired all at the same time. But I'm going to ask you a question because I know that your parents were both musicians. And your mother, Sylvia, I gather she was a bassoonist and played with the New York City Opera, recorded with Stravinsky. Even though you were obviously working on the character of Leia, did your own mother have any sort of shaping effect on your creation of the role? And I don't know whether that may be translated to Michelle at some point, too.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, Michelle's already alluded to it, but, I mean, it was, Steven and I are 10 years, he's 10 years older than me, and Leah, I think, is about 10 years older than my mother. But these were women of a generation that was sort of, right before Betty Friedan. I mean, it's right before the beginning of the coalescing of the post-war feminist revolution began. And there were promises that were opening up, possibilities that were opening up for women at that time, but no theory, no organized political movement, no critique of the patriarchy, all the things that then feminism created to sort of, prepare the way and to make it possible for women to take these risks and to recognize and own their own ambitions. As difficult as that still is for women, unfortunately the patriarchy is still with us, but the 40s and 50s, and you see it in a movie, we were talking in the green room, I mean, All About Eve, which is, because I'm gay, the Bible, but as great as it is, I mean, all the women characters are phenomenal, and the men are just a bunch of lunks. And it's very, in its own ways, very feminist, but there's this one scene where Mankiewicz has to punish her. She has that scene with Karen in the car where she says, if you don't have a husband at home, what are you? You're something. He doesn't even say you're someone. He says you're something with a suite of French provincial furniture or something. You're not even human. And, it's kind of stunning in this movie, you know, with this incredibly powerful female performance at the center, that still the bill had to be paid. She had to be told that she shouldn't be, you know, that her selfhood was a sin in some way. So, and my mother struggled with that tremendously, even though she had a professional career as a musician, and Leah clearly did. And a lot of that went into the work on the character.
And you mentioned, Michelle, you know, the last scene, you know, for you especially, but I must say that one of my favorite scenes in the film is the last one when Sammy goes to see John Ford. And I saw the film in October. I was shocked when I read the end credits that the old codger director is played by David Lynch, who is one of the great directors of the...
You didn't recognize him when he came?
No, I had no idea. In fact, my husband and I, we were, who is that? Who is that? He looked familiar, sounded familiar, but I couldn't place him. How in the world? I mean, how did the casting of David Lynch as John Ford come about?
It was my husband, who also really gets credit for putting Rita Moreno in West Side Story and casting Lynn Cohn as Golda Meir in Munich and Lee Pace in Lincoln. Steven said we were going around who would play John Ford. I had a well-known actor that I wanted, but he was really way too young. And whenever Steven is stuck about casting, he starts to fantasize that there's some room called maybe there is a room called the Screen Actors Guild Lounge or something in LA where there'll be some old actor that we can go and just pull out, and they're waiting for, and that, I don't think that exists. And we were going around, and I said, wouldn't it be great if it was a director who could play Ford? And I said to Mark, who just has this weird ability to do this, I said, do we know anybody, can you think of any director? He said, give me 1 second. He went up to his office and looked, he wanted to check the picture, and then came down and said, David Lynch. And then Steven asked David Lynch, and David Lynch said, I don't think so. And then Steven went to Laura Dern, who they have in common as a dear friend, and Laura Dern went to David Lynch and said, you sort of have to do this. And so he did it. It was that day on the set was that and the dance in front of the campfire. I think maybe the two most thrilling days I've ever spent on a film set with Steven.
Wow. Well, kudos. I'm going to say his name. Tony Kushner's husband is Mark Harris, who I think is one of the great writers about film. He's also my former student from when I taught at Yale. Okay. But he wrote the recent Mike Nichols' A Life and Pictures of a Revolution about film in the late 60s and the importance of all that was going on. And Five Came Back, which I think, talking about miniseries, though it was nonfiction, probably the greatest miniseries that I think I have seen about the filmmakers who during World War II were called into service and what they came back with. William Wyler, George Stevens, John Ford. I mean, it's such a brilliant series, so try to see that among other things. I know we're going to be finishing up very soon. It's kind of late for all of us, but this film essentially begins with Sammy in January of 1952 being taken to see the greatest show on earth. And P.S., I came from Paris to the United States when I was 3.5 to the Bronx. And the first film that I remember seeing, it was either The Greatest Show on Earth or Trapeze. I'm not sure because both are circus films, and it wasn't first run. This was when I would have been a little bit past, obviously past 54, 55. Do either of you have a kind of shaping memory of a first film that you saw that made you so passionate that you knew movies, if not a professional thing, that movies were somewhere that you wanted to keep being?
Well, it's funny, that story that you shared about Empire of the Sun, because that was the first sort of grown-up film that I ever saw. We didn't watch a lot of movies in my household, and we weren't allowed to watch things that my neighbors, friends were watching. And so I saw this movie at somebody else's house, and I had never seen anything like it. I didn't know that characters could be that complex, and I didn't know that you could risk an audience's love. And when I saw that movie and I saw that performance and I saw that kid, I thought, first of all, be a good girl. Otherwise, you're going to lose your family. And that had an effect on me, but it also just sort of opened my mind. Like, everything before then was sort of fairy tale. Like, I watched Sound of Music, I watched Wizard of Oz. Like, it was very sort of black and white, and that was actually the movie for me. So I'm so glad that Steven was wrong and that he allowed this kid to be multifaceted, because that was the movie that kind of introduced me to complexity.
Steven told me one more great Empire of the Sun story, that he was, I guess it was in Hong Kong, they were going to do the big, or maybe Shanghai, they were going to do the huge scene where, I think it's when the kid finds his mother again at the end of the movie, and it was the biggest group of people that Steven had ever filmed. It was like 50,000 extras, and they were like all these ADs moving everybody around. And the night before, he was really nervous, and he wanted to watch something on television, so he turned on the television, and by bad luck, the Russian 1967 version of War and Peace was on, and the Battle of Borodin, I guess, or Austerlitz, which is the largest film. They think it may be as many as 200,000 or 300,000 people on the camera. And he said, he was like, suddenly, it's like, oh, I might as well be directing, people sticking up a stagecoach when I was 30 years old, because there are all these hundreds of thousands of people, and he only had 30 or 40, so it sort of ruined his day the next day. I don't know what, I think the movie that I got most excited about was this not very good movie. It's another Joseph Mankiewicz movie. It's called The Honey Pot, and it's his adaptation of Volpone. Don't watch it, it's bad. It's Rex Harrison and Capucine, and because I was already gay when I was 10 years old and saw it, I thought, oh, how fabulous she was. Maggie Smith is in it, and I think Susan Hayward, and it's set in Venice, and it's not very good, but it has Ben Johnson's plot, and it's a really complicated plot. And my father, who was a conductor, often got a little confused by really elaborate plots, and he took me to see The Honey Pot. And after it was over, he said, I couldn't follow that at all, and I explained the movie to him. And he was really impressed by that. And he said, I think, maybe you'll be a writer. And we were not getting along all that well. And I think probably that, helped move me in this direction, so.
If he was a conductor, did you and he ever watch, maybe together, Preston Sturges's Unfaithfully Yours, where Rex Harrison plays the conductor?
No, and I'm old, so you couldn't say, let's sit down and watch this. We listened to the Ring Cycle together. That was our big bond, and he pointed out the leitmotifs. But
okay. One last question. This film, The Fabelmans, takes place, Sammy is 7 years old and up to 18. I gather you did lots of interviews that go past the age of 18 for Steven Spielberg. Might there be, if not a miniseries, a sequel at some point? Was that ever envisioned?
Well, I just sort of try and push him in the direction of doing the movie about the camping trip, which was what I always wanted him to do. That was the first story he told me on the set of Munich in 2005. I wrote a treatment for something that happened to him right after The Fabelmans ended. I don't know how to say it. The Fabelmans stops with him at 18, and then something happened to Steven right after that would make a pretty great movie. And I wrote a treatment of it after he told me this story, and about 6 or 7 years ago. And he read it and said, "Oh, that was fun." And then we never talked about it again. I don't think we're gonna do it, but maybe I love the Seth Rogen, Michelle Williams, 10-year.
Yeah, I mean, there's an implied chapter too. I mean, Leia did really marry Benny.
Well, yeah, Bernie was his name.
Yeah. So
and then Steven's father married a woman named Bernice, because you can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's like, what?
Really, clearly.
And Leah and Arnold stayed very close. And Arnold, I can tell this story because I know Steven Spielberg, that as Leah was getting sicker and sicker, Arnold decided that he would, Bernie had died, and he wanted to propose that they get remarried. And when he finally decided to do it, it was too late. She wasn't in the state to respond. But it's really one of the great love stories. I mean, they really loved each other. They just shouldn't have been married to each other, I guess.
I would love to keep talking to these two wonderful people, but it's getting really late. I just want to thank Tony Kushner, Michelle Williams, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.